Hey there everyone, so today we're going to continue reading Gilles Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. This time we're going to be looking at Chapter 4, Ideas and the Synthesis of Difference. And of particular importance in this chapter is taking the themes regarding difference and repetition so far in the image of thought and putting these together by concretizing the notion of the idea, as well as focusing on the chaosmos, the difference between differentiation and differenciation, and the larval subject. Now, an important thing that Deleuze is trying to do in this chapter is he's trying to find a way to talk about ideas in which ideas are not so much a consequence, but rather a foundation which occurs through conjunction of different factors and actually serves as something which is both transcendent and immanent. So thus, he's not talking about absolute transcendence. That's one of the things that actually he, kind of going off of Nietzsche, is trying to go against. But he's trying to get rid of this notion that problems and solutions are irreparably separated from one another. He wants to actually figure out how it is that a field of events or objects or singularities get constituted by the unity that is brought upon them by the notion of ideas. And he wants to continue coming back to this notion of the fractured I, the fractured cogito. He speaks of an I split from end to end by the form of time which runs through it. It must be said that ideas swarm in the fracture, constantly emerging on its edges, ceaselessly coming out and going back, being composed in 1,000 different manners. And what he's trying to do is talk about how singularities form. And singularities is an important element of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy as well, in which it basically is roughly equivalent to a habit, but it's different in many ways. A singularity is an object or a method of function or a mode of function which gets established through repetition and through the presence of, you've got different matters that get repeated in certain ways, and thus you have a singularity emerges. And I like to think of this as like a solar system, where you have massive objects, in the sense of having mass, which start to congeal into a solar system model. And in so doing, if you look on just the molar scale, on the large scale of all the different planets, you might think there's just a few bodies, a few singularities. But actually there's lots of singularities of, on each planet, there are different centers of mass, which create this whole complex system of this large planet, this molar mass, is an amalgamation of a bunch of molecular masses, which create this more large-scale phenomenon. And this is going to be an important theme of Deleuze's philosophy, is getting to that micro level, which has nothing to do with size, by the way. It's about the mode of functioning. It's about the way in which, on the molecular level of acting in the world, our categories start to break down just like they do in, for example, quantum physics. And as such, he wants to talk about a properly infinite field of continuity. Now, of particular importance in this chapter is Deleuze doing some very detailed, very advanced musings regarding differential calculus. Now, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not even a super proficient at math myself. I've passed a calculus class, but that's about as far as my math knowledge goes. But it's very interesting how Deleuze incorporates the notion of the differential, which is just dx, right? He writes that in relation to x, dx is completely undetermined as dy is to y, but they are perfectly determinable in relation to one another. For this reason, a principle of determinability corresponds to the undetermined as such. The universal is not a nothing, since there are, in Bordas's expression, relations of the universal. dx and dy are completely undifferentiated in the particular and in the general, but completely differentiated in and by the universal. The relation dy over dx is not like a fraction which is established between particular quanta and intuition, but neither is it a general relation between variable algebraic magnitudes or qualities. Each term exists absolutely only in its relation to the other. It is no longer necessary or even possible to indicate an independent variable. For this reason, a principle of reciprocal determinability as such here corresponds to the determinability of the relation. The effectively synthetic function of ideas is presented and developed by means of a reciprocal synthesis. And this is an important element of Deleuze's philosophy that, for example, you'll get in the Geology of Morals, in Thousand Plateaus, where Deleuze is trying to figure out ultimately how do things come to become expressible, sensible. What is the genesis of what we take to just exist? So this takes in kind of Deleuze's whole corpus. This is everything from territorial functions in animals. How do these become expressive? How does urination become, an expressive territorial pursuit that a dog can do, peeing around their territory in certain ways? This can be language. This can be the earth becoming expressive in the form of like geology. And what Deleuze is trying to do is in this dy over dx relation, we have reciprocal presupposition between two elements which are themselves in a constantly differentiating role. And there's two words that, and I already mispronounced it, and I need to do better about this, but Deleuze makes a difference between differentiation with a T and differenciation with a C. So when I say differentiation and I do the CH sound, that's how we normally spell the word with a T. But differentiation is another term that Deleuze is trying to use that he'll kind of make more sense out of as we go. But these are two slightly different ways of talking about how does difference work. And really, differentiation is the more molar form, whereas differentiation is the more molecular form. He writes, the idea has the differential relation as its object. It then integrates variation not as a variable determination of a supposedly constant relation, variability, but on the contrary as a degree of variation of the relation itself, variety, to which corresponds, for example, the qualified series of curves. If the idea eliminates variability, this is in favor of what must be called variety or multiplicity. The idea as concrete universal stands opposed to concepts of the understanding and possesses a comprehension all the more vast as its extension is great. This is what defines the universal synthesis of the idea of the idea, etc. The reciprocal dependence of the degrees of the relation and ultimately the reciprocal dependence of the relations themselves. So, not only do we have different flows or different objects relating to one another, but within these notions themselves, they are relating to their own relating to other things. It's kind of a difference within a difference within a difference, and so on ad infinitum. And how this difference works is precisely based on a fundamental degree of variation which something has by nature of its environment. So evolution is always an interesting way to talk about this. In evolution, or really just with an organism as a whole, it's trying to fulfill a function and, as Deleuze will say in this chapter, trying to confront a problem by adapting to its environment, ultimately. And as it passes on its genetic information, natural selection, of course, is going to select what behaviors are going to be advantageous in a given situation. And the advantageousness of that trait or that action or that feature is not distinguishable, or rather not separable, from the environment which allows it to express itself as being beneficial or deleterious. So thus, the idea of, suitability, for example, is dependent upon the reciprocal dependence of the organism to its environment, but also the fundamental expressivity of the trait, which occurs by nature of the fact that, let's take just like a skin color of an iguana, for example. Not only does that depend on the difference that is established between the skin color and the environment. So maybe it's like a brown color to blend in with the trees, or maybe it's a green color to blend in with leaves in a rainforest. Not only is there that level of difference, but within the notion of skin color itself is the very differentiable possibility that if it were in a different environment, it could be equally as suitable. So there's a sort of pliability in what we take as just apparent in and of itself, which can testify to its ability to adapt to different situations. With regards to calculus, he gives a quote here from Maimon, who's someone who's interpreting the differential calculus. And I think it really highlights the way this kind of reciprocal presupposition and this establishments of relations occur, in which Maimon writes, "A particular object is the result of the particular rule of its production, or the mode of its differential, and the relations between different objects result from the relations between their differentials." So at the heart of function and of something's ontological place is the differential, which is this kernel of difference that is built into everything, which allows it, in the example of the skin color of the iguana, for example, to be able to function in different environments, to be accountable for situations other than the one that it is immediately in. It's that thing which allows something to be able to be differentiated, to be able to become different, to, move forward in time, change place, is the fact that there is a fundamental pliability, a plasticity at the very core of which something is, which is precisely the fact that it is not reducible to an essence. Because for Deleuze, if things were reducible to essence, there would be no way for them to actually change and interact with differences that couldn't be reduced to the concept that already exists, that couldn't be reduced to identity, analogy, that he's already talked about in these chapters. This fundamental plasticity allows something to interact with a completely new situation and be able to respond, be able to adapt, even in these conditions which are so disruptive that the organism itself, or the object or the idea itself, must be razed to the ground. And he writes that the differential is indeed pure power. And this is an important theme that Deleuze is developing, is that difference is affirmative, it is productive, and it is powerful, and it is the fundamental nomos that is guiding the universe, and it is non-teleological, and thus, exemplified by the rhizome, for example. And it acts as the thing by which different temporalities and different spaces can be constructed. If one has read Deleuze before, but not read Difference and Repetition, you might get the notion that because he's clearly anti-Hegelian, because he clearly finds that reductive, and he's so anti-representationalist in all of his works, that one may forget his relationship to dialectics. Deleuze is a Marxist in many ways, while maybe that's not like his defining quality, he does retain a link to dialectics, insofar as dialectics for him is kind of as we see it early in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. It's the question of, or rather the process by which differences come into contact and conjunct themselves together and create something new in this process. Now, of course, Hegel goes on to add that, dialectics are a question of being driven by reason, that everything is fundamentally Geist, that difference presents itself as negation of concepts, and this negation, because it is ideal negation, can therefore be sublated and basically build up this snowball of Geist to the point where we get to absolute Geist. But Deleuze writes, we should speak of a dialectics of the calculus rather than a metaphysics. By dialectic, we do not mean any kind of circulation of opposing representations, which would make them coincide in the identity of the concept, but the problem element, insofar as this may be distinguished from the properly mathematical element of solutions. So one thing that Deleuze is poking at mathematics with regards to is there is an assumption, and sometimes it's a pragmatic assumption, but solvability inevitably becomes a problem in mathematics. Solvability, of course, is the way, it's kind of the medium by which mathematicians can make sense of, pure mathematics, which is just, it's very abstract. But, Deleuze takes out like Riemann manifolds, for example, and, loves differential calculus. And so he takes his fair bit of stuff from this. But what Deleuze wants to point out is the fundamentally problematizing nature of difference, and that problematization goes outside of representation. It doesn't reduce to our concepts of mathematics vis solvability, for example. It goes beyond that. So fundamentally what this kind of calculus is, which really Deleuze is trying to set up a calculus of emergence, of sense, of expressivity, of repetition, of the refrain, for example. But what he's trying to do here is fundamentally rooted in the notion of the problem, not in representation, because representation, like he's shown throughout, especially in the image of thought chapter, is going to reduce difference to conceptualizability or analogy or identity. He writes, we can therefore treat representations like propositions of consciousness, designating cases of solution in relation to the concept in general. However, the problematic element, with its extra propositional character, does not fall within representation. Neither particular nor general, neither finite nor infinite, is the object of the idea as a universal. This differential element is the play of difference as such, which can neither be mediated by representation nor subordinated to the identity of the concept. So at this fundamental level is a play of difference, which necessarily, when it comes to responding to a problem, which like I said, he's grounding even the very existence of organisms as a response to problems, and mathematics is a response to problems, and psychology and physics and philosophy, all of these are a response to problems, which are basically an outgrowth of the problematizing nature of difference as such. That we're constantly being assailed by things that are threatening our subjectivity. And there's a question of, extracting from all this stuff a way forward without just collapsing in on oneself and turning into like a catatonic sort of schizophrenic state, which is not something Deleuze romanticizes, even though it may seem like it if you read Anti-Oedipus, for example. But this play of difference, when it comes to proposing solutions, always some of that difference is extra propositional. It goes beyond what one states. When we think of statements of language, for example, there's always something slipping, which is extra propositional, which testifies to that which can't be assimilated in our representations of language, especially when we think of the fact that language is oftentimes institutionalized and focuses on getting rid of certain differences, and at the expense of these differences, establishing a formalized system, through mandatory schooling and things like this, which he talks about in A Thousand Plateaus and the Postulates of Linguistics. But the point is that there's something always extra propositional, which retains that problematizing nature, which testifies to the dialectical nature of problems, which is to say, it's about this contact between differential elements, which leads to what Deleuze calls fields of solvability. You could call these zones of confluence. You could think of these as solar system, orbital dynamic way of thinking about entities, that there's always kind of these centers of confluence. These would be like black holes, as they talk about it in contrast to white walls. You've got your black holes in the faciality chapter in A Thousand Plateaus. But a field of solvability is basically defined as, okay, we've got all these problems, and now it's our job as actors within this system to reel it in, to try to isolate flows, and to try to come up with a way to live in the world. So this is really the existential threat of the world itself, which Deleuze is always trying to maintain an in-between relationship with. We don't want to collapse under this pressure and just become liquid, because that would be death. That would be, going so schizo that you just commit suicide, which is not what Deleuze ever says we should do. In fact, in A Thousand Plateaus, in How Do You Make Yourself a Body Without Organs, makes very explicit that that is not what he wants to do. But neither do you just want to become pure revolutionary, just absolute deterritorialization, because that also gets you to the same fate. That gets you to, you tried to solve the problem too quickly, for example. So always there's this problematizing nature which comes when difference assails something stable and threatens its stability. And in that moment, the field of solvability is there to be reeled in and understood in philosophy, for example, such that we can figure out how to, find our lines of flight, for example. Now, when it comes to talking about ideas and formalizing what does Deleuze mean by ideas, we've got a couple things that he's adding here to figure out how do ideas function. And idea and concept, just like in Hegel, they're different things. He writes here on page 181, if ideas are the differentials of thought, there is a differential calculus corresponding to each idea, an alphabet of what it means to think. So these ideas are the differentials of thought. They have within them this variability, a quantifiability, something that we can take hold of and try to formalize, but always something which slips and which has the potential to be utilized in different domains. And this is really where the potential for creativity comes from for Deleuze. It's the fact that an artwork, for example, can be levied in multiple different fields and serve different purposes. It can be reactionary some places, revolutionary other places, and banal in even other places. And probably in most places it would be banal. I'm not really sure if we could make that statement. But the point, and he says this here on page 182, that ideas are multiplicity. Every idea is a multiplicity or a variety. Multiplicity must not designate a combination of the many and the one, but rather an organization belonging to the many as such, which has no need whatsoever of unity in order to form a system. So whenever an idea enters into a system, there is no unifying concept or representation or unity which is going to make one sure of how that idea is going to function. We are not given that sort of consolation. Deleuze denies the notion that we can abstract and transcend roles in which identities will always serve in a given moment, ideas will serve in a given moment. This is his critique of Freud, for example, with the Oedipus complex, is that Freud wants to say that in the realm of the unconscious is ultimately governed by the Oedipus complex, which is abstracted above the actual interactions that the patient undergoes throughout their lives, and is sort of it's like a claw, and it's picking out certain moments that serve to uphold the Oedipus complex and throwing out the ones that don't serve the Oedipus complex. This is both what Oedipus does and what Freud does, and thus Deleuze's fundamental critique is ultimately that this is an assumption. This is an assumed structure which is inherently unfalsifiable and in fact presupposes itself in which in actuality the differences, that which escapes from Oedipus, is actually what is primary. It is that fundamental irreducibility of ideas themselves. So thus there is a fundamental multiplicity which does not depend on its derivation from some unity. In the case of variation from the Oedipus complex for Freud, where variation becomes lack, for example, or it becomes castration, and it does so because it is not Oedipal, essentially. If it's not Oedipal, if it's not contributing to the complex, it's detracting from the psychological well-being of the patient, and thus Deleuze's critique of Freud as basically inventing these different cathexes and neuroses. So fundamentally, there is a multiplicity which, as Deleuze says, replaces the one no less than the multiple, and is the true substance itself. The variable multiplicity is the how many, the how and each of the cases. Everything is a multiplicity insofar as it incarnates an idea. So this idea, which really serves as an ordering principle to a particular selection of flows and bodies and events and objects, whatever you want to call them. It acts as this ordering principle which cannot be detached from them. As we've talked about with Deleuze's understanding of the differential calculus so far, these are in mutual conjunction, mutual presupposition. They are equiprimordial, as Heidegger would say. And as a result, the multiplicity of the idea occurs from the very fact that one way of organization, or one organization of things, For example, the organization of colors which forms the work of art, like we talked about before. That can be put into different fields, and because of the multiplicity of the idea behind what that piece of art means, what it expresses, because it's inherently multiplicitous, it can shift registers like that, and it can go from place to place and express itself differently. Thus, Deleuze writes on page 182, everywhere the differences between multiplicities and the differences within multiplicities replace schematic and crude oppositions. Instead of the enormous opposition between the one and the many, there is only the variety of multiplicity. In other words, difference. It is perhaps ironic to say that everything is multiplicity, even the one, even the many. However, irony itself is a multiplicity, or rather, the art of multiplicities, the art of grasping the ideas and the problems they incarnate in things, and of grasping things as incarnations, as cases of solution for the problems of ideas. So, right, this is the very centrality of difference as it exists in Deleuze's system. That difference is the fundamental motor which allows things in any case to not be reducible to the one, like Oedipus, for example, of this pre-social structure, but also not reducible to the many. It's not just pure material things that just have an expressivity on their own. No, they have expressivity, they mean something in relation to an idea which constitutes the consistency of that milieu. Thus, Deleuze writes, an idea is an n-dimensional, continuous, defined multiplicity. And that's about as good of a definition and about as succinct of a definition of an idea as you will get in this work, at least thus far. And that's on page 182. Again, an idea is an n-dimensional, which is to say it has multiple different dimensions. It can operate in multiple different registers, depending, like in the case of the work of art, depending on where it is incarnated. It is continuous, which is to say it has a continuity or a consistency of its own, a sort of logic that is unique to that idea. And it is a defined multiplicity. Now, something important that Deleuze wants to mention is precisely how unique ideas are in a sense, or at least the potential to be unique. Because obviously an idea can be unoriginal, right? I mean, that's just trivially true. But Deleuze wants to insist on the possibility that an idea can be used in a new way in which it hasn't been used before. In fact, just the very repetition of an idea in and of itself has a kernel of pure newness, of pure production. This is desiring production from anti-oedipus, and as it exists a little bit in 1,000 Plateaus. He says with regards to ideas and this unprecedented creativity of difference, that for ideas, they are not even actually existent, but inseparable from a potential or a virtuality. In this sense, they imply no prior identity, no positing of a something that could be called one or the same. On the contrary, their indetermination renders possible the manifestation of difference, freed from all subordination. And, we can use this when we're talking, for example, about the idea of freedom. Let's use the example of freedom. The idea of freedom has a history. What conflicts has it been used in? What constitutions is freedom a central focus in? How has freedom been postulated in relation to, kind of today, especially in more analytic circles, there's the question of how does freedom relate to the will in kind of the determinist versus free will fight with regards to the subject. So there's a history behind freedom that one may be tempted to assume that we are getting closer and closer to an absolute definition of what does freedom actually mean. And Deleuze is trying to fight against that notion of actually. Really, that idea of actually is actually serving to presuppose that what has been done beforehand is just this steadily increasing body of knowledge which is teleologically approaching some point of absolute truth. It presupposes a unity in the steps that an idea takes as it goes through its various incarnations, which Deleuze actually wants to flip on its head and say that, on the contrary, the idea has a fundamental possibility to incarnate itself in a completely new way. In a way which retains some completely creative, something completely unprecedented that hasn't been used in the way freedom has been levied before. Maybe this is using freedom to, in some completely unique state constitution. Now, while there are parts of that state that will be based on previous states, it's not the entirety of the Constitution itself which is unprecedented, but rather that there is a small part of it, a uniqueness that makes this thing what it is, which is irreducible to identity, to analogy, to similarity, to representation. It is fundamentally different. And he makes this very clear when he says, just as structure is independent of any principle of identity, so Genesis is independent of a rule of resemblance. So there is no pre-social rule of freedom ought to mean this and this thing. Now, there are tendencies of the way freedom has been used, the way freedom has been defined, but there's always the possibility that some philosopher can come along or some random kid can come along and just totally change the discourse around freedom, for example. And this relates quite interestingly to the actualization of expressivity and dynamism in the form of the organism. Deleuze writes on page 185 that an organism is a set of real terms and relations, dimension, position, number, which actualizes on its own account, to this or that degree, relations between differential elements. So, the organism as a whole is an actualization of a bunch of smaller tendencies, creating a sort of unified form, which, as Deleuze is trying to point out, is fundamentally fractured. It is not actually perfectly consistent, but it has this appearance of solidarity, of being static, which happens as a matter of actualizing difference. He writes that the genesis of development in organisms must therefore be understood as the actualization of an essence in accordance with reasons and at speeds determined by the environment, with accelerations and interruptions, but independently of any transformist passage from one actual term to the other. So that introduction of the environment relates back to how we've been talking about evolution thus far, in which the environment acts as the possibility for there to be a completely discontinuous relationship between the organism at one point in time and the other. There can be a fundamental break which occurs precisely because of a difference which has been allowed. And he gives us kind of an interesting explanation of this with regards to chromosomes and kind of organismal biology. He writes, chromosomes appear as loci, In other words, not simply as places in space, but as complexes of relations of proximity. Genes express differential elements, which also characterize an organism in a global manner, and play the role of distinctive points in a double process of reciprocal and complete determination. The double aspect of genes involves commanding several characteristics at once and acting only in relation to other genes. The whole constitutes a virtuality, a potentiality, and this structure is incarnated in actual organisms, as much from the point of view of the determination of their species, as from that of the differentiation of their parts, according to rhythms that are precisely called differential, according to comparative speeds or slownesses which measure the movement of actualization. So those elements of speeds and slownesses allow for different elements to come into conjunction, such that throughout fetal development, for example, chromosomes will act in different ways because, of course, the environment is an integral element of the expressivity of chromosomes or of a gene. So expressivity is directly tied to rates of speed and slowness. Now, in terms of the actual versus the virtual, this figures a lot in Deleuze's philosophy, but it's really important to keep in mind that the virtual is real. The virtual acts as an ordering structure, a sort of normalcy, per se, that is not separable, as we've said before, from the actual real, historical, material conditions of what the heck is going on. You can't separate those from the other. So, for example, what it means to dress properly. This is, in a sense, an idea. But this idea is inseparable from the historical conditions, from the material conditions. So, for example, even in very conservative societies, in moments of war, when textiles are being used a lot, such as in World War I and World War II, standards might start to shift a little bit. There are different priorities other than, how women are dressing. And as such, a little bit of leniency can't help but slip itself in. And thus, this idea of how it is to properly dress, what it means to be properly dressed, can undergo a register shift like that at the moment of the declaration of war, for example, where an order word, and this is a great reason to read the postulates of linguistics in A Thousand Plateaus, is that an order word instantly allows for an incorporeal transformation to occur, in which, for example, when it comes to what it means to be properly dressed, that can instantly shift, precisely just because the historico-material conditions have changed. And thus, a virtual idea, which is, these standards, these norms, which are, of course, linked to historical conditions, right? Norms have a reason why they exist, why they have become normalized, and that's part of what Deleuze is concerned about, is how to figure that out. But that norm always retains a virtual side of it, which allows it to interact with the environment in relation to the speeds and slownesses of what's going on. Deleuze writes, "It is as though every idea has two faces which are like love and anger. Love, in search of fragments, the progressive determination and linking of the ideal adjoint fields. Anger, in the condensation of singularities which, by dint of ideal events, defines the concentration of a revolutionary situation and causes the idea to explode into the actual." So, right, An idea can be connected to ideal events, such as the declaration of war, for example, which act as a virtual revolutionary situation, which is nonetheless real, and this reality becomes actualizable when the elements of society are in a certain condition, for example. And this is an important element of Deleuze's realism. He writes, there is an objectivity on the part of adjunction and condensation, and an objectivity of conditions, which implies that ideas, no more than problems, do not exist only in our heads, but occur here and there in the production of an actual historical world. So ideas do not merely retain this ideal nature in the Hegelian sense of ideal. They are not abstract ideals, which occur by basically reducing things to negation, to opposition, to contradiction, and as such kind of creating this idealist framework. No, it occurs via the productivity of an idea which links it to a actual historical world, which is itself actualized because of ideas, and ideas which are actualized because of the actual historical world. So you can't separate these two. It's a really important point that I want to make all the time when I talk about Deleuze, because there's this easy sense in which you can reduce Deleuze to a materialist, as like Jane Bennett and the vitalist school or the new materialist school likes to do, which I think is wrong. Ian Buchanan in Assemblage Theory and Method shows this wonderfully, because what Deleuze is much more concerned about is the way in which material matters find consistency, the ways in which they become expressive, which is a function of the actualization of ideas in an actual historical world. So this notion of actualization is really important because the notion of action links the virtual and the actual together. That the actual changes and undergoes repetition and difference because of a virtual constitution of a problematic field. And this, in Deleuze's philosophy, when it comes to, how people actually act, how we interact with ideas, is epitomized in learning. He wrote about this at the end of the last chapter, but he continues to write it when he says here on page 192, in fact, the idea is not the element of knowledge, but that of an infinite learning, which is of a different nature to knowledge. For learning evolves entirely in the comprehension of problems as such, in the apprehension and condensation of singularities, and in the composition of ideal events and bodies. Learning to swim or learning a foreign language means composing the singular points of one's own body or one's own language with those of another shape or element, which tears us apart, but also propels us into a hitherto unknown and unheard of world of problems. To what are we dedicated, if not to those problems which demand the very transformation of our body and our language? And this is Deleuze's call to what he calls a theater of problems and always open questions, which draws spectator, setting, and characters into the real movements of an apprenticeship of the entire unconscious, the final elements of which remain the problems themselves. So problems act as our way in which we are encouraged, it's not necessarily an imperative, but it is an encouragement to be creative, to not reduce the world to human knowledge, but in fact to take a very anti-philosophical step and learn to listen and to learn, to encounter the world in the mode of an encounter, not in the mode of ruling or dominion over the world, but rather a radical receptivity to the differentiation that will occur from that encounter. Now, the chaosmos is a really interesting concept that Deleuze develops here, which is explaining kind of two different registers of ontology, which constitute the univocity of being these biunivocal relations. And for example, Guattari loves in his writing to talk about biunivocal relations. There's in the fashionable nonsense with so-called, where they are trying to critique postmodernists and basically levying personal incredulity as an argument against very advanced 20th century philosophy. They say that, well, they show a Guattari quote in which he's talking about biunivocal relations and all this stuff, and they're like, this is just the most gibberish stuff we've ever heard. It's like, yeah, it's complicated philosophy. Doesn't mean you can just say it's wrong just because you don't understand it, especially when you probably haven't read these people. But when it comes to understanding what biunivocal relations are, I know that was a long way to get to this next little part, is the chaosmos, in which there is a fundamental force of chaos which guides the cosmos. This is the cosmic as it appears in the refrain in A Thousand Plateaus, for example. It is also the war machine. It's this fundamental multiplicity that pushes things forward. It's the violence of the eternal return. He writes, the throw of the dice carries out the calculation of problems, the determination of differential elements, or the distribution of singular points which constitute a structure. The circular relation between imperatives and the problems which follow from them is formed in this manner. Resonance constitutes the truth of a problem as such, in which the imperative is tested even though the problem itself is born of the imperative. Once chance is affirmed, all arbitrariness is abolished every time. Once chance is affirmed, divergence itself is the object of affirmation within a problem. So right, the notion of the problem that he's been talking about so far always has a fundamental bit of chaos, a fundamental bit of randomness, right? It's aleatory. And this in and of itself is the fundamental revolutionary nature, that kernel of difference at the very core of ontology, which is the chaosmos. This is the plane of immanence, the body without organs, the revolutionary stuff that makes Deleuze's philosophy so exciting. And this, of course, when one interacts with the chaosmos, when Deleuze and Guattari ask, how do you make yourself a body without organs? Like we've said before, this is a dangerous process. You can potentially either not go far enough or go too far, and in both cases you end up dead. And Deleuze is a life-affirming philosopher. I'll repeat that again. He is a life-affirming philosopher. And as such, he's trying to find a way to navigate through ontology via the sober gestures of learning, of adaptation, of philosophical thinking, which leads him to write here on page 199, the imperatives and questions with which we are infused do not emanate from the I. It is not even there to hear them. The imperatives are those of being, while every question is ontological and distributes that which is among problems. Ontology is the dice throw, the chaosmos from which the cosmos emerges. If the imperatives of being have a relation with the I, it is with the fractured I, in which every time they displace and reconstitute the fracture according to the order of time. So, right, the order of time in this situation is basically the habits that a field has. It's the tendencies of an assemblage constituted by these biunivocal relations between the chaosmos and the cosmos, between that fundamental war machine, that fundamental pure difference which cuts through that which is, that cuts through the I, that disassembles the I, the organism, and the cosmos, the structure which results, the tendency, the stability. And this is the relationship between schizophrenia and capitalism. Schizophrenia, body without organs, plane of immanence, chaosmosis. It's that fundamental difference which undergirds, but only in the sense of, it acts under like an evil genie which takes away all that is stable. But not undergirds in the sense of it's somehow more primary necessarily. The chaosmos isn't necessarily any more important than the cosmos. These exist in a biunivocal relation. They exist in mutual conjunction, in an equiprimordial relationship. So you can't differentiate, or you can differentiate, but you can't separate these two when you're trying to understand a problem. When you're trying to understand how an organism responds to problems in the case of establishing different functions, for example, you got to look at both the chaos and the order and figure out how they kind of form a puzzle together. Now, an important thing for understanding ideas is that ideas are not negative. In Deleuze's philosophy, ideas don't have the possibility for negativity. Now, when those ideas get conceptualized and they become concepts, which is built upon the territory that already exists, on that structure, on that cosmos, which has been built up through all these relations, through the solving of problems. This is the organism who, against the forces of nature, is able to assemble the body of these 1,000 little selves of the molecules and different flows of fluids into this organism. In response to all that stability that gets created, yes, negativity can come onto the scene. For example, there are certain foods that I can eat which are going to kill me. Right? That's just a fact. But that notion of that food being able to kill me, of it being bad for me, for example, there's nothing inherent in that food which makes it bad as such, right? Because badness, of course, is a predicate in the sense it depends on being in conjunction with something. It depends on a relativity defining what badness of a food even means. And thus, badness only gets established post hoc, after structures have come into play and are continuing to play. And thus, some food can be very bad for me, but for another organism, it can be perfectly tolerable. Even within humans, you got allergies. My fiance's gluten intolerant. I love gluten, but she would probably be in the ER if she had a little bit of gluten. So that very notion of negativity only comes after an idea which has a fundamentally virtual quality, interacts with a real historico-material field, and as a result, establishes tendencies which can allow for the possibility of negativity. But that negativity is fundamentally post hoc. And in that sense, difference is more primary. Difference comes first. Chaos comes first. And then that chaos is reeled in, so to speak. But at the same time, these are occurring right in the case of the organism trying to maintain homeostasis. These occur at the same time. But Deleuze wants to argue that insofar as the chaosmosis is infinite, There is a fundamental virtual quality about it, which makes it infinite, right? It can create an infinite amount of meanings, of expressivities. And that which makes sense, the organism which can maintain homeostasis, right? There is a limited amount of organisms that can maintain homeostasis. But there's an infinite amount of permutations of, different molecules and whatnot that could create possible different kinds of organisms, whether or not they're able to maintain homeostasis. And thus, Deleuze writes, it seems to us that pluralism is a more enticing and dangerous thought. Fragmentation implies overturning. The discovery in any domain of a plurality of coexisting oppositions is inseparable from a more profound discovery, that of difference, which denounces the negative and opposition itself as no more than appearances in relation to the problematic field of a positive multiplicity. I'll say that one more time. Difference, which denounces the negative and opposition itself as no more than appearances in relation to the problematic field of a positive multiplicity. He continues, one cannot pluralize opposition without leaving its domain and entering the caves of difference which resonate with a pure positivity and reject opposition as no more than a shadow cavern seen from without. So like I've said before, difference is primary, and negativity or opposition or the fact of a gene being deleterious, for example, only happens in response to a problematic field. And what allows that problematic field to come together, to make sense, is the existence of positive multiplicity, which ultimately acts as the nomos, of which the negative is only an after effect. Now, when it comes to reading Deleuze, and I really don't like to gatekeep with Deleuze because I really think he is such a fun thinker. I mean, I get excited every time I read his works. But this work is extremely hard. And Deleuze in general is extremely hard. You need a lot of background. No, I mean, I myself am no scholar. So anyone can do it with like a, few years of work or something. But I'm just saying, oftentimes there is the temptation to reduce Deleuze to a kind of revolutionary he's not. And this is often what the accelerationists do. That in response to structures which are trying to tie us down, our response is to basically go faster, to embrace that acceleration, to bring it to its limit, and in bringing it to its limit, I mean, what are we just laughing at the system, laughing at us? I mean, it might feel great, but ultimately it's only going to lead to, all these accelerationists love to flirt with left-wing ideas. They love to flirt with Deleuze, who is a left-wing philosopher. He's not a right-wing philosopher, but the accelerationists will turn him into a right-wing philosopher and make it say that, capitalism and schizophrenia, well, they're the same thing in many ways. Schizophrenia is able to outpace its own limits. Capitalism thrives on outpacing its own limits, just like Deleuze and Guattari say in Anti-Oedipus. And thus, we should fundamentally treat capitalism as a way to just go schizo. And we should just accelerate the rate at which capitalism proliferates. That was a nice little rhyme. But no, this is a fundamental misreading of Deleuze, which occurs because you're not reading closely enough to the fact that there is nothing which is intrinsically revolutionary. There is no type of movement which is intrinsically revolutionary. It depends on context, it depends on environment, it depends on the problematic field which has been established and the ideas which act within those fields. And if you reduce Deleuze to I don't remember who I heard call it tentacle philosophy. The way accelerationists read Deleuze, when they say, oh yeah, dude, it's just a matter of going schizo and like finding all your faces and your flows and like going crazy and just establishing all these revolutionary connections and just like changing the world, dude. It's like, no. Deleuze is fundamentally a sober philosopher concerned with looking at the consistency which a field has and figuring out what kind of changes you want to make in a very concrete and methodical and thought out way. And Deleuze, on page 207, gives us this caveat, essentially. Clearly, at this point, the philosophy of difference must be wary of turning into the discourse of beautiful souls. Differences, nothing but differences, and a peaceful coexistence in the idea of social places and functions. But the name of Marx is sufficient to save it from this danger. And he goes on to, talk more about this. But he's making fun of this reading of his philosophy of, nothing but differences in peaceful coexistence. No, this is a violent coexistence in which some ideas are microfascisms, as they call it in A Thousand Plateaus. Some ideas are not revolutionary just because they're fast, for example, or just because they're quote-unquote radical. I was teaching a kind of seminar presentation on Deleuze's philosophy, and we were talking about what it means to be creative, what it means to become minoritarian, according to Deleuze. And one of the people in the seminar had mentioned Kanye recently. Well, Ye, as he went into his Nazi phase, and he's, wearing this like black mask, and he's on Alex Jones, and he's saying all this crazy stuff. And the guy in this seminar was like, well, that was pretty revolutionary. That was pretty disruptive. And that is the fundamental misreading about Deleuze, that disruption equals revolution. That doing something new means it's therefore good. No. Deleuze is not valorizing or romanticizing newness or creativity as such. He is using this as a way for us to explain how do things come about and how can we cope with the inadequacy of things in order to create something new which is going to be affirmative to life. So that's a really important consideration to keep in mind when you're reading Deleuze. Now, finishing up here, he's been talking about the difference between the actual and the virtual. And he made a point that both the actual and the virtual are real. It's not like the virtue is just this, it's not just an abstract concept he made up. It's not an abstraction. It's not somehow less real. Because ideas start wars, and ideas like proper dress are virtual. So in response to this, he gives us a way of thinking about the emergence of structures and functions. He writes on page 214, beneath the actual qualities and extensities, species and parts, there are spatio-temporal dynamisms. These are the actualizing, differentiating agencies. They must be surveyed in every domain, even though they are ordinarily hidden by the constituted qualities and extensities. Embryology shows that the division of an egg into parts is secondary in relation to more significant morphogenetic movements. The augmentation of free surfaces, stretching of cellular layers, invagination by folding, regional displacement of groups. A whole kinematics of the egg appears, which implies a dynamic. Moreover, this dynamic expresses something ideal. Transport is Dionysian, divine, and delirious before it is local transfer. Types of egg are therefore distinguished by the orientations, the axes of development, the differential speeds and rhythms, which are the primary factors in the actualization of a structure and create a space and a time peculiar to that which is actualized. And he's using at the time of his writing, some very recent discoveries in embryology, which is that in early embryonic stages of development, you can have a wide range of mammals which will look exactly the same. Thus, at the very origination of embryonic development, you have the possibility for very similar genetic information to transform in the process of conjunction with the environment into a large variety of forms, which in fact depend on just a few genetic differences, which allow for different proteins to be created that will turn on and off other genes, which will allow for the differentiation of this otherwise nearly identical early embryonic stage. And what this means is that, like we've been talking about genetics before, there is a fundamental plasticity of the expressivity of genetics. And I know that's a very complex way of saying something that might be very simple otherwise. But there is a fundamental dynamic or dynamism in the gene that testifies to the fact that it doesn't mean anything on its own. It requires being in mutual, equiprimordial conjunction with the environment, and in so doing, allows this Dionysian, delirious possibility of the early embryonic stage to undergo all sorts of changes. I mean, the changes of the embryo is quite crazy. He writes, for example, there are things that only an embryo can do, movements that it alone can undertake or even withstand. For example, the anterior member of the tortoise undergoes a relative displacement of 180 degrees, while the neck involves the forward slippage of a variable number of protovertebrae. The destiny and achievement of the embryo is to live the unlivable, to sustain forced movements of a scope which would break any skeleton or tear ligaments. And that's the fundamentally revolutionary nature of difference, of being in a state in which really the embryo represents for Deleuze the receptivity of someone who is ready to learn, of someone who is ready to make themselves a body without organs, which is not to say reduce yourself to pure difference, pure flows, singing kumbaya in this kind of like revolutionary chic of accelerationism. No. In fact, you use the receptivity of the mode of being that is the larval subject, as he calls it, this embryonic mode of functioning, of this early possibility in which all sorts of normally unlivable things become livable, that in this mode of functioning, one can create. He writes on page 215, rather than discovering the more general beneath the less general, we discover pure spatiotemporal dynamisms, the lived experience of the embryo with regard to the constituted parts and qualities, beneath the morphological, histological, anatomical, physiological, and other characteristics. Rather than going from more to less general, determination progresses from virtual to actual in accordance with the primary factors of actualization. And I'll say that again because the last part is super important. Determination, which is to say expressivity, how something comes to exist, how it comes to have a determinate stability function. Determination progresses from virtual to actual in accordance with the primary factors of actualization. So in the case of genetics, for example, genes have a virtual function. And this virtual function, which is somewhat similar to possibility, but he kind of wants to problematize that notion of possibility, for example, because it's not the possibility of the virtual which allows it to become actual. It is the spatiotemporal dynamism that is virtuality, this plasticity of the virtual that allows it to incarnate itself in different fields, which allows that plasticity to become plasticized in accordance with factors of actualization, which is to say the real stuff, the material stuff that's going on. So the virtual comes first. In the case of genetics, for example, genetics come first in the case of like a modern organism, which, has a complex genetic code. We can go into a whole different discussion about abiogenesis. Genetics has bred within it that virtual possibility to mean a number, even maybe an infinite amount of things, in considering with the infinite possibilities of the environment, which, in accordance with factors of actualization, becomes actual. And thus he writes, before the embryo as general support of qualities and parts, there is the embryo as individual and patient subject of spatiotemporal dynamisms, the larval subject. So when you ask yourself, why does Deleuze seem to romanticize schizophrenia? Why does he seem to romanticize the invalid, the grotesque, the child, the minoritarian in society? He does it because that which exists on the outskirts actually has the most revolutionary potential, because it signals the spatiotemporal dynamisms which are threatening the interior. As such, he writes on page 219, what is fixed is not ready-made or already complete. When we remain or become again embryos, it is rather because of this pure movement of repetition, which is fundamentally distinguished from all regression. The larvae bear ideas in their flesh, while we do not go beyond the representations of the concepts. They know nothing of the domain of the possible, being close to the virtual, the first actualizations of which they bear as though they had chosen them. So I hope that this has helped understand Deleuze's philosophy. This is a particularly difficult chapter in many ways. I specifically didn't cover a lot of the kind of abstract mathematical concepts because I'm not a mathematician, and hopefully someone who's more mathematically literate like Deleuze himself can explain it better than I can. But if you enjoyed this video, check out any of my other content. I've done stuff on the previous 3 chapters in this work, as well as other stuff on Deleuze and Guattari, postmodernism, gender theory, German idealism. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.